Clara Vance, and I was 33 years old the week my own parents sold the only home I ever truly cared for by forging my signature. I was 7,000 miles away working on a seismic highway project when a neighbor sent me a text message with a photograph. A bright red "Sold" banner was bolted across a real estate sign planted right in the middle of my front lawn. My father would later smirk and tell me that my property had funded their family getaway. He had no idea what he had actually attached his signature to. What I uncovered in the municipal land records turned a luxury vacation into an active criminal investigation. Welcome back to Silent Justice Diaries, where quiet individuals face loud betrayals and walk away with their dignity and the absolute proof. If a calm woman holding a well-organized binder of documents is your idea of justice, you are in the right place. Leave a comment and make sure to subscribe. People tend to assume civil engineers are emotionless and cold. We are not. We simply put our trust in structures that can support weight, whereas most people cannot be relied upon. I constructed my entire existence around that principle, one verified calculation at a time. No shortcuts and no handouts. I did not earn myself. The only place I ever allowed myself to soften was a small weatherboard house on Elmhurst Lane, painted white with a deep navy blue door. My grandfather, Arthur Sterling, purchased it back in 1974 and spent half a century refining it with his own two hands. He taught me how to read a spirit level before I could even read a wristwatch. On the day I graduated from university, he pressed his solid brass front door key into my palm and folded my fingers over it. "A house is just a commitment you make to yourself," he told me. I carried that key on my keyring for 11 years, and it is still sitting there today. Elmhurst Lane was not a mansion. It had 2 modest bedrooms, a wide covered porch, and a kitchen that perpetually smelled like rich coffee and cedar sawdust, regardless of how vigorously I scrubbed the counters. Yet it belonged to me in a way nothing else in my family ever did. It was chosen, not randomly assigned. My mother inherited the fine porcelain. My brother received all the endless admiration. I received the house. For a long time, I genuinely believed that was my family finally getting something fair and right. That particular week, the brass key felt heavier than normal in my coat pocket. I tried to convince myself it was just the freezing weather. It wasn't the weather. There was something my grandfather had mentioned during his final summer that I wouldn't fully comprehend until years later. Not until a clerk at the county registry office handed me a sheet of paper bearing my own signature, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had never signed it. Arthur passed away 14 months prior to these events at the age of 84, drifting off peacefully in his sleep in the bedroom he had painted 3 separate times just to get the exact shade of white right. The funeral service was intimate. My mother wept the loudest and departed the earliest. A week later, an estate attorney named Victor Thorne summoned me into a wood-paneled office downtown and slid a thick legal folder across his desk. I was 32, utterly drained, in the middle of a massive engineering contract and surviving entirely on grief and bitter espresso. He used legal terminology I had heard before: irrevocable trust, successor trustee, primary beneficiary. I signed wherever his pen pointed. I distinctly recall thinking that the property was legally mine now, and that was the only detail that mattered. "Read through this when you have the room to breathe again," Thorne said, gently tapping the cover of the folder. I never did. I tucked it away in a filing cabinet drawer and returned straight to the job site, because work was the single thing in my life that never demanded to know how I was coping emotionally. That was my fundamental blunder, and I take full responsibility for it. I was always the dependable one, the person who resolved issues. So when my mother offered to hold on to a spare key for routine maintenance, saying, "You're never in town anyway, darling," I handed it over without a second hesitation. When my father mentioned he would keep an eye on the plumbing while I was abroad on assignments, I expressed my gratitude. I literally handed the individuals who resented me the most a full set of keys and a massive head start, and I mistook it for being a devoted daughter. I had spent my entire adult life demonstrating that I could carry every burden independently. It never crossed my mind that the people I trusted were actively measuring the dimensions of my rooms for a complete stranger. The wooden porch swing was the first piece Arthur constructed at that property, and it was the very last thing he stopped using. He shaped the solid timber himself out of cedar and branded his initials into the armrest along with the year, A.S. 1974. When I was a little girl, I used to sit on his lap out there while he explained why a structural beam carries physical weight and why a person carries moral obligations. During the summer before he passed away, his movements had slowed considerably, but he still made his way out to that swing every single evening. One sunset, he patted the wooden slat beside him, and we rocked in silence for a while. Out of nowhere, he made a comment that I have reconsidered thousands of times since. "This property will never end up in the hands of anyone who didn't earn it," he told me firmly. I made certain of it. I chuckled slightly and asked what he meant by that. He simply gazed out across the front lawn, as if he could perceive a structure I couldn't yet see. "Attorneys are useful for one specific task," he noted, "ensuring that dishonest people cannot grab what doesn't belong to them." I figured he was just being theatrical. He was a master carpenter who was deeply skeptical of commercial banks and had an affinity for official paperwork. I loved him dearly, so I let the comment slide. I had no idea he had spent his final lucid years collaborating with Victor Thorne to construct an legal fortress that nobody could breach. The cedar swing was still hanging from its chains the week my entire world fractured. I constantly find myself reflecting on how he had prepared for a devastating tempest that I couldn't even fathom yet. He understood the nature of his own daughter far better than I understood my own mother. He simply chose never to declare it aloud. Instead, he embedded his judgment directly into the legal architecture of his estate plan. Then he sat back and waited, as resilient as cedar timber, to be proven completely correct. My mother never truly forgave her own father for the contents of his will. That is where this entire conflict originates. Evelyn Sterling Vance is 60 years old, and she has spent every single one of those decades entirely convinced that the world owes her far more than she has ever received. She was the direct daughter, the immediate bloodline. Yet her father left the family home to the granddaughter who cleaned his roof gutters instead of passing it to her. At the reception following the funeral, she voiced her discontent loud enough for me to overhear. "That was my father's house," she complained to my aunt while dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. "It rightly should have belonged to me." I let the remark pass. I convinced myself that acute grief causes people to utter unreasonable things. My brother Julian is 29 years old and has never allowed a single real-world consequence to touch his life. He held a corporate consulting position that he abruptly abandoned, had a fiancée he effortlessly manipulated, and maintained a credit card balance that our parents discreetly paid off like they were topping up a parking meter. My father, Thomas, who is 62, managed our household under one overriding philosophy: maintain the quiet at all costs, which in practice meant handing Julian whatever was required to stop his endless whining. "Clara is doing just fine," my father would dismissively say whenever my name came up, waving his hand as if clearing a settled invoice. "She doesn't require our help." I built that self-sufficient reputation with my own sweat. I readily admit that. Because I never asked for assistance, they simply concluded that I never would. They observed my reliable engineering salary, my fully paid-off vehicle, and my structured, quiet existence, and they saw not a human being, but an unexploited financial reserve. Throughout all those years, my mother was staring at the single possession I cherished most, and viewing it as an asset that had been stolen from her. I should have recognized the severe warning signs in that behavior. I was far too consumed with playing the role of the low-maintenance daughter to notice the family members who were actively generating chaos. The major international assignment arrived in early March, a massive seismic highway reinforcement contract located just outside Osaka, Japan. It required 11 weeks on location, the precise kind of high-stakes project that defines a professional career. My engineering firm required a specialist who wouldn't hesitate at grueling shifts and intercontinental travel. I accepted the role before my director even finished explaining the terms. I was exceptionally skilled at departing. Leaving was simply another heavy load I knew how to balance. The final week before I boarded my flight, I executed my usual routine. I arranged every recurring utility bill on automated bank payments. I walked my parents through the location of the main plumbing shutoff valve and taped a detailed checklist to the kitchen refrigerator in my precise architectural handwriting, because I have always believed that if instructions are clearly documented, failure is impossible. That is the fundamental creed I live by. Engineers rely on thorough documentation the way religious individuals rely on scripture. My mother walked through the rooms with me that afternoon, gracefully tracing her fingers along the timber stair banister that Arthur had smoothed by hand. "Don't stress over a single detail, darling," she assured me warmly. "We will look after everything with the utmost care." I remember feeling genuinely moved by her words. I actually thought that the shared loss of Arthur might have softened her bitter edges. I embraced her at the threshold and experienced one foolish, fleeting moment of believing I possessed a supportive, loving family. 11 weeks. I would return almost before the summer heat peaked. I provided my father with the security alarm sequence so he could monitor the interior humidity. I handed my mother the backup brass key. I literally delivered my sanctuary to them, piece by piece, then boarded a flight across the Pacific, feeling proud of myself for being so accommodating and easy to manage. They never actually needed to locate the plumbing shutoff valve. What they desperately required was the property deed, and they already knew precisely where I kept it. The initial red flag occurred 3 days before my departure, though I dismissed it as trivial at the time. My mother inquired, with an exaggerated casual tone, where Arthur's original property documents were stored. I informed her that Attorney Thorne held the primary legal bindings, while I kept reference photocopies inside my desk drawer. She simply nodded as if the information were completely inconsequential. It was far from inconsequential. Shortly after, Julian, who almost never reached out to me, initiated a phone call. He claimed he wanted to discuss our family's wealth management, a phrase that, within the vocabulary of the Vance household, explicitly translated to someone needing an immediate cash injection. I told him I was swamped with pre-flight preparations and promised we would analyze things once my contract concluded. He lapsed into a heavy, sullen silence that should have immediately triggered my suspicions. During the very week I landed in Japan, his social media account suddenly erupted with glossy screenshots of an exclusive cliffside resort along the Amalfi Coast. He posted images of private infinity pools, a dedicated gourmet chef, and an overall price point that I could easily calculate just by looking at the background architecture. "Massive upgrades on the horizon," he wrote in the caption. My brother hadn't worked a legitimate job in over 8 months. I remember frowning at my smartphone screen from inside an Osaka hotel room that smelled of tatami mats and sea breeze, wondering to myself, where on earth is he securing the capital for that? Before I could dwell on it, a junior contractor required my authorization on a structural load diagram, and the question evaporated from my thoughts. There was one additional incident, a text message from an unfamiliar phone number that my mother forwarded to me without adding a single word of context. It was a local real estate agent inquiring whether the current property owner had reconsidered listing the Elmhurst Lane residence on the open market. I typed a single, unequivocal word in response. No. My mother quickly reacted to my message with a simple thumbs-up icon and a digital heart emoji. I assumed the entire inquiry was permanently terminated. I had just issued a firm rejection to a stranger regarding an action that, entirely without my knowledge, had already been executed. That digital heart emoji wasn't a signal of agreement or understanding. It was a silent farewell to my ownership. The work in Osaka consumed my attention entirely, precisely as complex engineering tasks always do. 11 weeks compressed rapidly into a blur of days that commenced long before sunrise and concluded over illuminated blueprints late into the night. I experienced content in the narrow, specific manner I understood best, being highly productive, physically exhausted, and thousands of miles removed from anyone attempting to extract something from me. I routinely dialed my parents' house on Sunday mornings. Those conversations progressively shortened. My mother claimed she was overwhelmed with charity committee meetings. My father was vaguely preoccupied around the yard. Julian was never available to speak. I attributed the distance to the drastic time zone difference and my own chronic tendency to mistake conversational silence for mutual peace. One evening, suffering from severe jet lag and staring at the ceiling, I sat on the edge of my hotel mattress and turned my metal keyring over in my fingers. The brass key caught the warm glow of the bedside lamp, its edges polished smooth by Arthur's thumb over decades, and subsequently by mine. I retraced my final actions before departing for the airport, how I had firmly secured the navy blue door, tested the deadbolt twice exactly as my grandfather had instructed, and lingered for a moment too long on the front porch. The cedar swing had shifted gently in the afternoon breeze, the AS 1974 carving capturing the fading sunlight. I remember thinking to myself, I'll apply a fresh coat of sealant to the porch railing as soon as I get home. Such a simple, confident, ordinary little objective. I possess zero capacity to comprehend that while I slept across 8 international time zones, my immediate family was gathered around a kitchen table alongside a complete stranger, a stack of legal contracts, and a ballpoint pen, systematically ensuring that my home would no longer be waiting for me upon my return. I had locked the front door securely. I simply failed to lock out the individuals to whom I had voluntarily handed the keys. That quiet evening in Japan was the final night my home remained undisturbed and solely mine. By the 6th week of my contract, a phone call finally shattered my sense of security. I dialed home on a Tuesday afternoon, an unscheduled call prompted by a temporary site inspection delay that freed up my schedule. My mother answered on the 10th ring, sounding flushed and surrounded by background chatter. "This really isn't a convenient moment, sweetie," she said hurriedly. I asked who was visiting the house. "Oh, just some contractors handling the landscaping," she stammered. "We're taking care of it. Don't you stress over a single detail." There it was again, taking care of it. Within the Vance family dynamics, that specific phrase consistently masked a major decision from which I was intentionally excluded. I asked her directly and plainly if everything was secure with the residents. An uncomfortable silence stretched over the line, one so vast I could have driven a heavy earth mover through it. "Everything is absolutely fantastic," she declared, her tone artificially elevated and bright. "You just concentrate on your highway project." Then the line went dead before I could formulate a follow-up question. I stood out on the balcony of my Japanese hotel room, the mobile phone still warm against my ear, feeling that familiar professional instinct creeping up my neck, the sharp intuition that warns an engineer when structural calculations fail to balance, demanding immediate investigation before a catastrophic failure occurs. I sent a direct text message to Julian. No response. I messaged my father. Complete silence. I attempted to convince myself that I was succumbing to baseless paranoia, that my 11-week assignment was nearing its conclusion, and that I would calmly untangle whatever minor misunderstanding had occurred over a cup of coffee on my own porch swing. I very nearly succeeded in calming myself down. I went to sleep, and 48 hours later, my longtime neighbor, a retired high school principal named Martha, who had watched me grow up from childhood, transmitted a single digital image accompanied by 3 brief words that instantly turned my circulation to ice water. The photograph captured a clear view of my front garden. The 3 accompanying words read, "Is this real?" I opened the image attachment while standing in a slow-moving queue for morning coffee in the hotel lobby, and my paper cup never reached my lips. There stood my property. The crisp white weatherboards, the distinctive navy blue door, and Arthur's cedar swing, just visible in the background on the porch. Planted firmly into the soil, right where my grandfather used to cultivate prized roses, stood a commercial real estate sign, large, glossy, and professional, with a vibrant red rider bolted securely across the upper frame. Sold. Not for sale. Not coming soon. Sold. The word loomed there in the garden bed, as if it possessed every legal justification to exist. I stared at Martha's message 3 separate times. Is this real? I typed my reply using fingers that suddenly felt completely disconnected from my nervous system. I am currently stationed in Japan. I never authorized a listing. Are you positive that is my address? Her response materialized almost instantaneously. My dear, a commercial moving van was parked in your driveway last Saturday. Your mother was standing on the lawn, directing the loading crew. A moving van, my personal belongings, my grandfather's heirloom tools, the brass spirit level he used to teach me basic geometry, the rustic kitchen that always smelled of timber and coffee, all of it systematically packed into a transport truck, while an unfamiliar real estate sign declared ownership over the lawn. Part of me wanted to scream until my voice gave out. I didn't. Something deep inside my mind grew exceptionally still, an icy quiet, mirroring the exact atmosphere on a construction site during the split second before the team realizes a primary support beam is failing. I set my coffee cup down onto a lobby table. I walked calmly back to my room, booted up my laptop computer, and began my work. Whatever manipulation had transpired, it would inevitably generate a documented paper trail, and documented paper trails represent the precise language my family never bothered to master, a language I am fluent in every single day. A piece of real estate cannot be legally transferred by individuals who do not hold the title. I understood that concept with the same absolute certainty that I understand the tensile strength of structural steel. Therefore, either my entire understanding of my property's ownership was fundamentally flawed, or someone had fraudulently attached my name to a binding legal contract while I was sleeping on another continent. I elected to call my mother before accessing the municipal database because some lingering, naive fragment of my personality still hoped for a rational explanation. She answered on the second ring this time, her voice overflowing with synthetic enthusiasm. Clara, how are things progressing out in Osaka? She spoke as if nothing whatsoever had occurred, as if the ground beneath my feet hadn't completely shifted. Mother, I said, keeping my vocal tone level and measured, why is there a commercial sold sign bolted into the lawn on Elmhurst Lane? The brief silence on her end of the line was thick with calculation. Then she let out a light, fragile laugh. Oh, goodness! We intended to update you on that. Everything transpired so incredibly fast. So fast? 11 solid weeks of we're taking care of it had apparently culminated so fast. Explain to me precisely what transpired, I instructed. Well, darling, the housing market reached an absolute peak. We secured an extraordinary financial offer. Your brother urgently required. She abruptly paused, catching her slip. The family required this liquidity. You were thousands of miles away anyway, and that property was simply sitting there unoccupied. I posed the only question that held any legal relevance. Who signed the property transfer deed? Another heavy hesitation over the line, followed by a bright, evasive deflection. Oh, don't get tangled up in tedious administrative details, Clara. The transaction is finalized. It's a wonderful outcome. In the background, I could clearly hear Julian's voice, boisterous and completely unconcerned. Make sure you tell her the villa features 2 private infinity pools. 2 private infinity pools. My grandfather's life's work and my personal sanctuary had been liquidated to finance 2 swimming pools on the Amalfi Coast. And then my mother, a 60-year-old woman, uttered the specific justification she had been internally rehearsing ever since the reading of Arthur's will, the sentiment she genuinely believed to her core. That home should have been bequeathed to me originally, Clara. I am simply reclaiming the inheritance that was rightfully mine. I did not engage in an argument. Debating with my mother had never shifted a single millimeter of reality throughout my entire existence. Instead, I replied with a voice as cold and decisive as a closing vault door. "I understand, Mother. Enjoy your vacation." I immediately terminated the call, launched my web browser, navigated to the Municipal Land Registry public portal, and began to investigate. Here is the specific detail where most observers misjudge my actions. I did not immediately rush to the airport to catch a flight home. Every instinct within my body screamed at me to board the next plane, march onto that front lawn, and rip the wooden sign out of the earth with my bare hands. However, I was bound by a professional engineering contract, a legally enforceable obligation. The highway reinforcement project had a critical structural load test scheduled in 12 days, and I was the sole certified engineer on site authorized to execute the sign-off. If I abandoned my post, the entire project timeline would slip by a full month, putting my professional reputation in jeopardy. So I made the more difficult, disciplined choice. I stayed in Japan and systematically assembled an airtight legal prosecution from across the globe. Engineers do not yield to panic. We collect data. At 2 a.m., with my tea growing cold on the desk, I accessed the Municipal Electronic Registry and inputted the exact parcel identification number I had committed to memory the day Arthur first explained property taxes to me. The system loaded the record, and the reality materialized on my screen. A standard warranty deed recorded 6 weeks prior, formally conveying the Elmhurst Lane property to a married couple named the Bennetts. The listed grantor, Clara E. Vance. My legal name, my residence. It was a formal property conveyance I had zero knowledge of, authenticated by a signature attributed to a woman currently residing on the opposite side of the Pacific Ocean. I sat frozen in my chair and read through the document 4 distinct times, and on each pass, the identical impossible statement confronted me. I had supposedly transferred title to my own property while asleep in an Osaka hotel room. This left only 2 logical conclusions. Either I was suffering from a severe psychological break, or a third party had forged my signature onto a binding legal instrument I had never even physically touched. Allow me to pause here for just a moment, because I know many of you watching or reading this narrative are experiencing that familiar drop in your stomach. If you have ever functioned as the dependable pillar in your family, the individual whom everyone assumes can absorb infinite stress, the person whose boundaries are routinely ignored when group decisions are made, you recognize this precise, icy clarity. Stay with me through this. The situation becomes considerably more severe before it resolves, but the ultimate resolution is worth every second of patience. Ensure you are subscribed so you don't miss the conclusion. I scrutinized that recorded deed with the exact intensity I apply to a failed structural inspection report, methodically hunting for the specific anomaly that explains the structural collapse. The official date of execution immediately demanded my attention. April 19th. On April 19th, I was physically standing on an elevated concrete highway, span outside Osaka, wearing protective safety gear, surrounded by 30 international construction witnesses, and captured in time-stamped site documentation, holding a specialized tension calibration gauge. I had signed absolutely nothing on that specific Tuesday in Japan other than a routine equipment manifest and an engineering compliance certificate. Therefore, the signature inked onto that warranty deed, the one spelling out Clara Evelyn Vance in a fluid, looping script that attempted to mimic my handwriting, was an undeniable fabrication permanently enshrined in public records. Forgery. The term settled into my thoughts quietly and completely, precisely like a definitive mathematical solution. Next, I examined the official notary acknowledgement block. Every valid property conveyance requires 1. A certified notary public, who legally swears under oath that the individual signing the instrument physically appeared before them and executed the document in their presence. The official seal stamped onto my fraudulent deed belonged to a notary commissioned within our home district. The printed name beneath the crimson ink seal was Vanessa Jenkins. My first cousin, Vanessa, Evelyn's niece. She was 41 years old, perpetually hovering on the brink of financial disaster, and had obtained her public notary license 2 years prior without ever seeming to utilize it for legitimate professional practice. She had officially sworn under her government-issued seal that she had physically witnessed me execute a legal contract while I was actually stationed 7,000 miles away. I didn't experience emotional rage at that point. Rage consumes immense mental energy, and I required every ounce of my cognitive capacity for the forthcoming task. Instead, I felt a sensation that was far more rigid and unyielding, like a steel support beam locking firmly into its structural socket. I submitted an immediate administrative request for an officially certified sealed hard copy of the deed, paid the required municipal dispatch fee, and waited patiently. A digital screenshot is merely an unverified claim. An embossed, certified document is an undeniable legal weapon. I was entirely finished raising my voice in conflicts with family members who had elected to wage their war using fraudulent paperwork. The physical certified copy arrived at my hotel front desk 9 days later, forwarded via international courier by my corporate headquarters, and stamped with the official raised municipal seal. I deliberately waited until the late evening to break the envelope. When the construction site was shut down and absolute silence filled my room, I slid the documents out and positioned them flat across my desk beneath the direct light of the lamp. There it lay, authentic, binding, and embossed, the warranty deed that purported to transfer my grandfather's legacy to complete strangers. I forced my eyes to examine the signature line, Clara E. Vance, rendered in someone else's studious attempt at my penmanship. Whoever executed the forgery had clearly practiced my style. The initial C was reasonably accurate, but the distinct flat-topped R I consistently draw was executed completely wrong. I have signed my name to more than 10,000 engineering diagrams throughout my career. I know the visual mechanics of my own signature as intimately as I know my own reflection in a mirror, and this was an imposter wearing my identity. Directly beneath the forged script, dated April 19th, sat Vanessa's official notary seal and her accompanying signature, formally certifying under penalty of perjury that she had witnessed the act. I retrieved my official passport and opened it beside the fraudulent deed. Osaka International Airport entry stamp, March 11th. No departure stamps existed until my scheduled exit in June. Next to the passport, I placed my official construction site electronic badge log. April 19th. Initial entry scan recorded at 6:47 a.m. Final departure scan recorded at 19:12 p.m. Location: Osaka, Japan. 3 distinct pieces of paper arranged side by side beneath a hotel desk lamp, conveying a narrative so coherent and undeniable that even a small child could follow the logic. It was physically impossible for me to have signed that property deed, and the public official who swore under oath that I did was committing a documented crime. I photographed all 3 documents together in a single frame, ensured the metadata timestamps were embedded, and transmitted copies to 2 separate, secure cloud storage repositories. Then I leaned back in my chair and exhaled. I finally grasped what Arthur had meant when he spoke about attorneys and constructing barriers that dishonest individuals cannot overcome. I simply needed to verify whether the legal fortress he had engineered was still holding its structural integrity. Early the following morning, I placed a direct call to Victor Thorne. The attorney recognized me the moment I stated my name. Arthur's granddaughter, he said warmly. The structural engineer. Your grandfather spoke about your career constantly. I briefed him on the situation in a logical, chronological sequence, exactly how I would deliver a technical briefing to a site inspector. The appearance of the sold signage, the recorded warranty deed, the forged signature, Vanessa's notary seal, and my physical presence in Japan, confirmed by passport and site logs. He remained entirely silent while I laid out the facts. When he finally spoke, his demeanor had shifted entirely. His voice had become sharp, professional, and coldly precise. "Clara," he began carefully, "do you recall the specific documents you signed in my office during the week following Arthur's funeral?" I admitted frankly that I had failed to read them due to my emotional exhaustion at the time. He didn't offer a single word of professional reprimand. "Your grandfather did not transfer that Elmhurst Lane property to you via a standard last will and testament," Thorne explained. "He formally transferred the real estate into an irrevocable private trust 3 years prior to his death. That property is legally owned by the trust entity. You are designated as the sole primary beneficiary and the active successor trustee." I sank deeper into my chair. "What precise legal implication does that carry regarding the recent property sale?" I inquired. "It means," Thorne stated with measured emphasis, "that your parents and brother attempted to sell a piece of real estate they never held the slightest legal authority over. The home was never their property. In fact, it wasn't even yours to sell as an individual citizen. It belongs strictly to the legal trust, and you hold exclusive administrative authority over that trust. Whatever conveyance documents they signed or fabricated, they executed them as private individuals who possess zero statutory claim to the title." I thought back to Arthur rocking quietly on the cedar porch swing, the timber warm beneath our hands, the AS 1974 carving catching the evening light. I made certain of it. He had uttered those exact words half a century after building the home. During his final years, when he must have finally allowed himself to acknowledge the bitter reality of his family's dynamics, he had foreseen this exact scenario. He had sat in Victor Thorne's office while my mother dismissed him as a stubborn old man, and he had quietly, meticulously constructed a legal mechanism that rendered it impossible for her to accomplish what she had just attempted to do. "There is an additional detail you need to understand," Thorne continued, "and you will want to brace yourself for the mechanics of the trust's protective forfeiture clause." Thorne articulated the legal architecture precisely the way Arthur would have appreciated, clearly, stripped of jargon, and grounded entirely in statutory strength. "In the majority of legal jurisdictions," he explained, "a property deed executed via a forged signature is classified as void ab initio, meaning it is entirely void from the absolute beginning. It is not merely voidable, it possesses zero legal validity. It transfers no title whatsoever, not even to a bona fide third-party purchaser who paid market value in absolute good faith without knowledge of the fraud. The Bennett family currently believes they own that Elmhurst Lane property. In terms of legal reality, they do not hold title, and likely never did. A fabricator cannot pass legal title because your family never held any valid title to convey in the first place. The necessary legal remedy was a methodical sequence of actions, not an emotional confrontation. We would first file a formal notice of lias pendens against the property, a public declaration recorded in the municipal registry, signaling that the property title was actively disputed and subject to litigation, thereby preventing any subsequent resale or mortgage financing. Following that, we would initiate a quiet title action in civil court, requesting a judge to formally confirm the irrevocable trust as the rightful owner and order the cancellation of the fraudulent deed. Simultaneously, we would file a constructive trust claim to trace and freeze the illicit sale proceeds wherever my family had deposited or spent them. Then Thorne elaborated on what sounded like an afterthought, but was actually the structural centerpiece of Arthur's planning, the protective forfeiture provision. Arthur had explicitly instructed Thorne to draft a strict interim, no contest/forfeiture clause directly into the estate instruments. Any named beneficiary who attempted to misappropriate trust assets via fraud, manipulation, or contestation would immediately and permanently forfeit their entire legal interest in the estate. My mother Evelyn and my brother Julian were each slated to receive independent distributions from a separate cash trust upon settlement. By coordinating the fraudulent execution and recording of that deed, Thorne noted with professional gravity, they had almost certainly triggered the exact legal trap designed to neutralize them. I absorbed every technical detail without uttering a single interruption. When he finished outlining the framework, he simply asked how I wished to proceed. I looked out across the illuminated skyline of Osaka and reflected on how my mother had dedicated 60 years of her life to being loud, demanding, and self-righteous. I have no desire to engage in shouting matches with them, I stated calmly. I want to file the paperwork. That became the overriding strategy. There would be no dramatic domestic arguments, no screaming confrontations in residential driveways, just properly executed documents performing the exact function that legal instruments are engineered to perform. I would allow printed records to communicate everything I refused to waste my breath vocalizing. I returned from Japan 11 days later on an overcast Thursday morning, having executed the final structural engineering sign-offs for the highway project without a single compliance flaw. I drove my rental vehicle directly from the international terminal to Elmhurst Lane, without stopping at my temporary residence first. I lacked a permanent home to return to, and I needed to evaluate the physical site conditions with my own eyes. The commercial signage remained planted in the soil. Sold. The bright red banner was slightly weathered from recent rain. A smaller real estate agent's contact placard had been attached to the lower post. A massive commercial steel waste dumpster sat parked squarely in my gravel driveway. Peering through the front living room window, I observed that the interior kitchen had been systematically stripped. Arthur's custom-built timber cabinets had been ripped from the walls. Fine white gypsum dust coated the flooring where the scent of cedar and roasted coffee used to linger. The Bennett family was already actively transforming the property I cherished into a residence they believed they had legitimately purchased. Out on the covered porch, the cedar swing remained suspended from its ceiling chains. A.S. 1974. It swayed gently in the autumn breeze, the single original fixture the demolition crew hadn't yet managed to discard into the waste bin. I sat inside my parked vehicle across the street for an extended duration. I retrieved my keys and isolated the solid brass door key. Holding it tightly, I stepped out of the car, walked across the lawn, and inserted the metal shaft into the navy blue door's lock cylinder. It slid in effortlessly. The mechanical mechanism my grandfather had installed back in 1974 still turned smoothly in response to his original key. I could have pushed the door open and walked right inside my own building. Instead, I turned the lock back to the secure position, withdrew the key from the cylinder, and slid it safely inside my coat pocket. Not yet. Entering the residence at this moment would constitute a dramatic theatrical gesture, precisely the kind of emotionally driven behavior Evelyn would execute. I was committed to operating with methodical patience. I drove to a quiet business hotel located near the interstate highway, organized my comprehensive evidentiary binders across the desk surface, and contacted Victor Thorne to confirm I was physically present in the jurisdiction and prepared to execute our filings. My family remained entirely ignorant of my return from Japan. Therefore, when I approached my parents' front door on Friday evening and rang the bell, my mother's facial expression transitioned through a fascinating sequence: initial shock, rapid calculation, and finally, a carefully fabricated, welcoming smile. "Clara, goodness, you should have sent a text message." She reached out to embrace me. I permitted the physical contact without reciprocating. Inside the living room, Julian was lounging on the sofa, displaying a deep bronze tan from his Italian vacation, while continuously scrolling on his smartphone. My father Thomas occupied his leather recliner, projecting the relaxed demeanor of a man who had successfully pulled off a major financial triumph. They had successfully liquidated my property, financed a lavish international excursion, and were comfortably settling in to enjoy the remaining proceeds. The single individual capable of dismantling their scheme had just walked through their front door, yet they still confidently assumed I was the compliant daughter who never generated static. "Come in. Sit down, darling," my mother fussed, gesturing toward an armchair. "How is the engineering contract in Osaka?" I declined the seat. I stood in the center of the room and asked in a quiet, even tone, "Who authorized the sale of my house?" The ambient temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly. My mother immediately launched into her pre-planned narrative, the unprecedented real estate market values, the once-in-a-lifetime financial opportunity, the pressing financial requirements of the family unit. I permitted her to exhaust her vocabulary without interruption. When she fell silent, my father, 62 years old, shifted backward in his leather recliner, fixed me with a patronizing smirk at the corner of his mouth, and delivered the specific sentence that would haunt his legal standing for the remainder of his life. "Your house funded their getaway, sweetheart." He articulated the statement with the condescending tone of a wealthy patron tipping a service worker, as if he were describing an act of profound generosity. From the sofa, Julian let out a short, dismissive snort, without bothering to lift his eyes from his digital screen. My mother at least possessed the situational awareness to look momentarily uncomfortable, averting her gaze. I simply smiled, a genuine, measured smile, because my father had just voluntarily confessed in the direct presence of 3 individuals that he possessed full knowledge of who rightfully owned the property, yet had intentionally proceeded to liquidate it anyway. I elected not to disclose the evidentiary cards I held. Not yet. I allowed him to enjoy his arrogant smirk while remaining completely oblivious to the legal firestorm building around him. I simply responded with a neutral, mild tone. "Is that a fact?" Then I turned and walked out the front door, leaving them to their mutual self-congratulation. The Bennett family deserved far better treatment than the fraudulent scheme my relatives had inflicted upon them, and I kept that reality at the forefront of my strategy. They were a hard-working young couple, a registered nurse and a high school mathematics teacher, who had combined their life savings to secure a starter home, only to purchase a sophisticated fabrication. Therefore, before Thorne executed any legal filings that would impact their lives like a collapsing structural beam, I personally visited the property and knocked on the navy blue door. I watched the young woman's expression drain of color as I calmly and gently presented the certified documentation, explaining that the individuals who executed the conveyance never held legal title, that the signature on the instrument was a verified forgery, and that a formal judicial notice was about to be registered against the property records. "We purchased comprehensive title insurance during closing," her husband stammered, gripping the doorframe with white knuckles. "That is excellent news," I reassured him firmly. "You are going to rely on that policy, and it is designed to protect your financial interests. This situation is entirely not your fault. You conducted your purchase in absolute good faith. The individuals who orchestrated this fraud are the ones who will bear the legal and financial consequences." I provided them with my direct contact details alongside Victor Thorne's professional card, recognizing that the most compassionate action I could take was to guide them toward legal transparency immediately. Following that meeting, we executed the precise statutory procedures. Thorne formally filed the notice of Ellis Pendens with the county clerk that afternoon, an official public document recorded against the Elmhurst Lane title declaring the property subject to active judicial litigation. The exact second that instrument was entered into the municipal ledger, the real estate was completely frozen. It could not be resold to another party. It could not be utilized as collateral for financing or loans. The Bennett family could not be summarily evicted into a worse administrative predicament, and my family could no longer conceal or manipulate the transaction records. A single legal filing executed with precision, and their entire financial scheme ground to an absolute halt. My mother discovered the reality through standard administrative channels. She received an urgent communication from the closing escrow agency, after which she immediately attempted to contact me. For the very first time in my memory, her voice over the voicemail system carried the distinct, unmistakable resonance of genuine panic. I declined to answer her initial incoming call. I allowed it to route directly to my digital voicemail, followed by a second attempt, and subsequently a third. Each recorded message escalated systematically from feigned confusion to indignant anger, and ultimately to that melodramatic performed sorrow she had deployed to manipulate situations throughout my life. I systematically archived every single audio file, not for dramatic personal playback, but because panicked individuals frequently articulate voluntary admissions of guilt, and I wanted Thorne to maintain an exact timeline of her psychological unraveling. In the interim, the underlying legal prosecution assembled itself from indisputable factual records. Thorne retained the services of an accredited forensic document examiner, a highly experienced investigator who had served as an expert witness in over 40 complex financial fraud trials. She conducted a rigorous structural comparison between the questioned signature on the warranty deed and 15 authenticated specimens of my handwriting, subsequently drafting a technical report stating in uncompromising professional terminology that the disputed signature was definitively not authored by my hand. Furthermore, she subpoenaed Vanessa Jenkins's official notary public journal, the mandated chronological ledger every commissioned notary in our jurisdiction is statutorily required to maintain, and confirmed that any entry corresponding to the date of April 19th was entirely absent. There existed no log, no identity verification record, and no statutory trace of the witnessing act Vanessa had sworn under oath had occurred. The transaction escrow file also yielded a fraudulent power of attorney document, purportedly executed by me, assigning comprehensive administrative authority over my real estate assets to my father Thomas while I was deployed in Japan. That instrument was similarly forged. The primary deception had required a secondary layer of fabrication just to maintain an appearance of legitimacy, and now both fraudulent instruments were sitting organized on Victor Thorne's desk. Let me pause here once more. Observers consistently ask me why I didn't lose my temper, why I didn't broadcast the entire ordeal across social media platforms, and how I maintained such rigid emotional discipline. Here is the objective truth I would impart to anyone facing a similar crisis. An emotional shouting match dissipates into the air by the following morning, but a properly recorded legal instrument remains permanent in the public archive. If you are the type of individual who values securing a quiet, permanent victory over participating in a loud, temporary argument, our philosophies align perfectly. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can examine the final resolution together. The inevitable family meeting had been scheduled, and my relatives genuinely believed they had summoned me to bully me into administrative submission. My mother's tactical playbook, whenever genuine consequences loomed, relied entirely on a single familiar strategy: cast me as the aggressive antagonist and manufacture emotional drama until I abandoned my position. Text messages arrived in rapid succession. I was systematically destroying the family unit. I was displaying cold, ungrateful behavior. I was acting entirely unreasonable. Julian initiated a direct call, not to offer a shred of remorse, but to vocalize his terror. "Are you literally attempting to send our parents to prison over a piece of property?" he demanded over the line. "Do you have any conception of how destructive that makes you look?" I calmly informed him that I hadn't placed anyone in any position. They had structured their own legal liability the moment they picked up a pen. My father left a single, ominous voicemail message, his condescending tone replaced by low, aggressive intimidation. "If you proceed with this legal action, you are permanently removed from this family. We are entirely finished." I listened to that recording twice, recognizing a profound, almost humorous irony. He was threatening to sever my connection to a family unit that had already conspired to liquidate my personal sanctuary while I was overseas. There was literally nothing left for him to sever. What they consistently failed to comprehend amidst their vocal outrage was that I wasn't operating from a place of emotional rage, the specific state they required me to be in, so they could manipulate the outcome. Angry individuals engage in negotiations. Angry individuals can be worn down by emotional fatigue until they eventually surrender. I had zero intention of surrendering anything. I was simply allowing the legal process to cure and harden on its own independent schedule, precisely the way poured concrete sets, completely unaffected by whoever happens to be screaming at it. "Attend the family gathering this Sunday," my mother finally transmitted via text. We will resolve this situation rationally like mature adults. Your father is operating the barbecue, a domestic gathering designed to subject me to coordinated group pressure, hosted in the exact backyard overlooking Arthur's cedar porch swing. I transmitted a single-word reply, confirmed. They assumed they were setting an emotional trap. I permitted them to arrange the seating for my structural presentation. Prior to that Sunday afternoon, two critical developments finalized my evidentiary file, transforming it from a defensive response into an absolute legal checkmate. First, Thorne conducted a comprehensive statutory review of the trust's forfeiture provisions alongside a senior probate litigation specialist, confirming our legal position. By deliberately organizing a fraudulent conveyance of property owned by the Sterling Trust, Evelyn and Julian had definitively violated the explicit forfeiture clause Arthur had instituted. The financial distributions earmarked for their inheritance, approximately $40,000 per person, would statutorily bypass them and revert immediately to the alternate designated beneficiary, a charitable educational endowment Arthur had established years prior. Second, the Regional District Attorney's Real Estate Fraud Division officially accepted our criminal complaint. Thorne had transferred the complete evidentiary package, the forged warranty deed, the fabricated power of attorney, the accredited forensic examiner's technical analysis, Vanessa's deficient notary records, and my certified international travel documentation, directly to their investigative unit. A lead investigator named Detective Miller contacted me via phone. "Ms. Vance," she stated with professional clarity, "this represents one of the most thoroughly documented, unambiguous forgery schemes our unit has reviewed. We are initiating formal criminal proceedings immediately. The charges involved multiple felony counts, forgery of property titles, uttering a fraudulent legal instrument, and official notary misconduct, the last of which would immediately strip Vanessa of her public commission and expose her to substantial penal liabilities." I expressed my professional gratitude to Detective Miller, terminated the call, and sat quietly in my room, organizing my documents into precise, sequential stacks, exactly how I arrange architectural diagrams prior to initiating a structural build. I experienced no emotional thrill of vengeance. I simply felt balanced and exceptionally steady. When Sunday afternoon arrived, the weather was exceptionally clear and warm, the sort of pleasant day that makes a suburban backyard appear deceptively serene. My father was stationed at the outdoor grill, wearing his cooking apron and actively projecting an atmosphere of domestic normalcy. My mother had arranged refreshments on the patio table, alongside a tray of the peach cobbler she exclusively bakes when she is attempting to secure a favor. An audience of extended relatives had been assembled to witness and validate my expected submission. 2 aunts, an uncle, and a couple of distant cousins. In the far corner of the patio sat Vanessa Jenkins, looking physically exhausted and pale, as though she hadn't achieved a full night's sleep in weeks. And there, positioned at the edge of the property line, hung Arthur's cedar swing. AS 1974 was visibly branded into the wood, rocking gently in the afternoon breeze as if reserving a space for the true homeowner. I had previously coordinated with the Bennett family, requesting their presence at precisely 3 p.m. They arrived on schedule, entering through the side garden gate with understandable apprehension, the young nurse holding tightly to her husband's arm. My mother's curated smile faltered immediately upon recognizing them. "Clara, who on earth?" "I requested their presence," I stated clearly. "They are essential stakeholders in this transaction." I positioned my formal legal binder onto the surface of the picnic table, leaving it closed, and politely declined the glass of iced tea my mother offered. My father turned away from his grill, spatula in hand, re-engaging that familiar, patronizing smirk. "Glad to see you finally came to your senses, Clara," he announced to the audience. I hadn't uttered a single syllable regarding my mental state, but I allowed him to indulge his assumptions. The most effective method for disarming opponents who anticipate an emotional argument is to maintain the quiet, accommodating demeanor of the low-maintenance daughter for just one more minute. Behind me, the wooden swing chains creaked softly. My mother initiated the proceedings, assuming her customary role as the family authority figure, directing her remarks toward the assembled relatives rather than addressing me directly. "We are a close-knit family unit," she proclaimed, her vocal tone vibrating with artificial sentiment. "Families navigate complex financial decisions collectively. Clara has been deployed overseas for months. She simply lacked visibility regarding the fiscal realities we were managing. And now, she has unnecessarily engaged legal counsel regarding a simple administrative misunderstanding involving a house." "An administrative misunderstanding?" One of my aunts nodded in immediate, conditioned agreement. "It was your father's property originally," my mother continued, repeating the internal justification she had relied upon for decades. "It rightfully should have been transferred to me. I simply corrected an administrative error to claim what was mine." My father rested his spatula on the side table and leaned forward, eager to capture the audience's attention. He repeated his preferred declaration to the gathering, projecting the absolute confidence of a man who believed his victory was untouchable. "That property funded our family getaway," he declared broadly. "Clara has established a highly lucrative career. She didn't require that underlying capital. We did." From his garden chair, Julian added his careless contribution. "It's literally just a building, Clara." I allowed their collective rationalizations to hang in the air without interruption. I allowed the murmuring aunts, the frowning uncle, and the entire domestic jury my mother had assembled to observe the family's official version of events. Once absolute silence returned to the patio, I reached out and lifted the cardboard cover of my binder. The entire garden fell entirely silent at the simple, ordinary sound of cardboard separating. It is remarkable how quickly physical evidence silences a room. I did not raise my voice. I did not adopt an aggressive posture. I methodically extracted the documents and arranged them across the table, surface one sheet at a time, face up, operating with the precise methodical cadence of Detective Miller, presenting evidence, or Arthur organizing his carpentry tools. "This instrument is the recorded warranty deed purporting to convey the Elmhurst Lane property," I stated in a level, instructional tone. "Entered into municipal records on April 19th. I laid down the subsequent document. This is the signature appearing on that conveyance, attributed to me." Next, I distributed the reference packet. This is a compilation of 15 authenticated specimens of my actual signature. The accredited forensic document examiner retained for this matter has issued a formal report confirming that the handwriting on the deed was executed by an unauthorized third party. My mother's mouth fell open, her vocal cords entirely paralyzed. I continued my presentation, speaking with the calm clarity of a university lecturer. "This is the official public notary acknowledgement block, certifying under statutory oath that I appeared in person within this municipal jurisdiction on April 19th to execute the instrument." I placed the next sheet onto the timber table. "This is a certified reproduction of my government passport. It confirms my entry into Osaka, Japan on March 11th, with 0 international departures recorded until June." I set down my corporate engineering logs. "This electronic record confirms my physical security badge scanned onto a highway construction deck in Osaka at precisely 6:47 a.m. on the morning of April 19th. I shifted my gaze toward the corner of the patio, fixing my eyes directly on Vanessa, whose facial complexion had drained to the color of wet cement. "Furthermore, there exists 0 chronological entry within your official notary public journal corresponding to that transaction date, Vanessa. Statutory regulations mandate the immediate logging of all notarial acts. Your official records are entirely blank for that day." Not a single person on the patio moved a muscle. My father's smug expression had dissolved into a rigid, paralyzed mask. "We also recovered a power of attorney instrument from the closing file," I continued smoothly, "supposedly executed by me, assigning comprehensive property rights to my father. That document has also been confirmed as a forgery. Therefore, the factual record demonstrates the creation of two fraudulent legal instruments, the submission of a false notarial attestation and the attempted sale of real estate that none of you ever held legal title to. I place my hands flat against the table surface, my demeanor entirely composed and steady, because that property never belonged to you. It was legally transferred into Arthur Sterling's irrevocable trust 3 years prior to his death, and I hold exclusive statutory authority as the successor trustee. My mother's artificial composure shattered completely, not into sorrowful weeping, but into explosive, unfiltered rage. The authentic personality beneath her lifelong performance finally surfaced. "How dare you sit there and lecture us?" she screamed, pushing herself out of her chair, spilling her beverage across the table. "We are your immediate family. How can you operate with such cold, calculating disrespect?" The entire assembly held its collective breath, waiting for my emotional retaliation. I provided her with the single, immutable answer I had carried across the Pacific Ocean, speaking in a voice that required no elevation to carry across the yard. "Because the property you attempted to sell was never yours to convey." I allowed that legal reality to echo across the garden. Then I calmly detailed the remaining procedural consequences, speaking with the neutral authority of a judge reading a finalized verdict. The forged deed was legally void ab initio. It had transferred zero title to anyone, meaning the Bennett family, currently standing pale and silent by the garden gate, had never legally acquired the property and would be fully indemnified by their title insurance underwriters and by the legal claims instituted against the perpetrators. A formal notice of Ellis pendens was already actively recorded in the county registry. The property title was frozen and could not be transferred or leveraged. A quiet title lawsuit was pending to clear the public record. A constructive trust claim had been filed to trace and freeze the illicit sale proceeds. The district attorney's real estate fraud division had assumed active jurisdiction over the criminal violations. And finally, I noted, Arthur's irrevocable trust incorporates a specific statutory provision, a clause he instructed his attorney to draft years ago because he understood exactly what his family members were capable of, which immediately strips legal inheritance from any beneficiary who attempts to misappropriate trust assets. I looked directly at my mother and brother. "You didn't simply lose control of the real estate you attempted to misappropriate. By executing this scheme, you triggered the statutory forfeiture mechanism Arthur engineered to protect the estate. You have legally disinherited yourselves." The domestic gathering immediately devolved into chaos, while I remained seated at the center of the patio, entirely unaffected by the emotional turbulence I had anticipated for weeks. My mother reverted instantly to her theatrical tactics. The tears materialized on command, accompanied by hysterical declarations regarding her lifelong parental sacrifices, systematically deflecting moral responsibility in every direction except her own. My father stood up with such violent momentum that his lawn chair toppled backward onto the grass. He began shouting that I was a treacherous daughter, that no loyal child would initiate legal action against her parents, and that I would suffer severe remorse for my actions. He stood there stripped of his authority, a patriarch with no remaining leverage. Julian's tan seemed to vanish beneath a pallor of sudden panic. "How much of the sale proceeds are the underwriters demanding back?" he stammered toward anyone listening. "I already spent a massive portion of it. I don't have the liquidity to repay that." The mathematical reality of his Amalfi Coast excursion was colliding with legal liability in real time, and civil asset recovery courts do not offer financial discounts for luxury infinity pools. The extended relatives who had arrived expecting to validate my submission were now staring at my mother with wide eyes, rapidly reevaluating decades of her fabricated narratives. And then Vanessa simply collapsed emotionally. She stumbled away from the perimeter fence and grasped my forearm, her facial expression displaying a raw, unfiltered honesty that no one else in my family had managed to project. "I was desperate for the financial compensation, Clara," she whispered, her voice shaking violently. Evelyn assured me there was no legal risk. She swore the home was legitimately hers. I am supporting 2 children on my own, and I desperately needed the money she offered me to stamp the documents. I looked at her, and I will not claim I experienced zero empathy. She was the sole individual on that patio speaking the objective truth. However, truth delivered after the fact does not erase a fraudulent government seal, and her professional attestation had directly facilitated the attempted theft of my grandfather's legacy. "I understand, Vanessa," I said quietly, gently removing her hand from my arm. "I genuinely regret that they manipulated your financial vulnerability." That simple acknowledgement represented the absolute limit of my compassion, and it did not constitute statutory forgiveness. I methodically gathered my documents back into the binding folder, aligned the physical edges with precision, and stood up from the bench. The vocal shouting continued to swirl around the yard, but it possessed no further power to impact my decisions. I walked across the patio toward the Bennett couple lingering near the gate and reassured them once more that their legal standing was secure, that Victor Thorne would coordinate with their legal counsel on Monday morning, and that they bore zero moral liability for the transaction. The young nurse was wiping tears from her cheeks. "I am so deeply sorry about the disruption to your home, Ms. Vance," she said with genuine empathy, expressing more authentic consideration than any member of my own bloodline had mustered. I assured her that the property represented something far more significant than physical timber and nails, and left the conversation there. Then I executed the single physical task I had flown back from Japan to accomplish. I walked directly across the front lawn to the commercial real estate sign, planted in the exact soil where Arthur used to cultivate his prized roses. I gripped the wooden vertical post with both hands and pulled it upward out of the earth in one fluid, decisive motion. Soil scattered across the grass blades. I carried the sign across the driveway and deposited it flat inside the commercial waste dumpster, resting it directly atop the broken remnants of my grandfather's custom kitchen cabinetry. Looking back toward the elevated porch, the cedar swings swayed gently. A SS 1974 captured the late afternoon sunlight, and I allowed myself a moment of quiet reflection. Then I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved the solid brass key, the exact instrument Arthur had pressed into my palm on my graduation day, the mechanism that still operated the lock cylinder, and folded my fingers tightly around it, mirroring the exact gesture he had utilized years prior. "I am available to communicate through legal counsel if you wish to contest the filings in court," I announced toward the patio without raising my voice. "Otherwise, I will be returning to my residence." I walked out through the front gate, the brass key resting securely in my pocket, and did not turn my head to observe my family, realize that the quiet, dependable daughter had methodically, comprehensively, and legally dismantled their entire operation. The subsequent legal proceedings required nearly 2 full years to reach absolute conclusion, because authentic justice operates at the deliberate pace of judicial documentation rather than the rapid speed of television dramas. The quiet title litigation concluded with a civil judge issuing a formal decree, canceling the fraudulent warranty deed ab initio, and restoring public title of the Elmhurst Lane residence exclusively to the Arthur Sterling Trust, confirming my ongoing authority as successor trustee. The Bennett family was entirely indemnified. Their title insurance underwriters absorbed the closing transaction loss and immediately instituted aggressive subrogation litigation against my family members to recover every dollar of the illicit proceeds, joining forces with Victor Thorne's constructive trust asset recovery claims. A substantial portion of the capital Julian expended on his Italian vacation was forcibly liquidated directly from my parents' retirement accounts. Because Julian possessed zero personal assets or real estate to attach, the remaining balance was converted into a formal civil judgment that will encumber the credit profiles of all 3 individuals for the next several decades. The trust's protective forfeiture clause was fully upheld by the probate court. My mother Evelyn and brother Julian permanently forfeited the cash distributions they had been relying upon, nearly $40,000 per person, and those funds were immediately redirected to the alternate charitable entity Arthur had designated within the trust architecture. The criminal prosecution proceeded along its own statutory timeline. Confronted with overwhelming, undeniable documentary evidence, both of my parents elected to execute formal plea agreements to felony counts of real estate forgery, rather than face a public jury trial. They received sentences involving supervised court probation, mandatory financial restitution, and permanent felony records that cannot be expunged. Vanessa Jenkins was stripped of her public notary commission by state regulators and accepted a separate misdemeanor plea agreement. At my explicit request, Detective Miller incorporated a formal notation into the investigative file highlighting Vanessa's early administrative cooperation, which represented the final fragment of professional leniency I possessed, and considerably more consideration than her actions warranted. I have not engaged in a single verbal conversation with my father since that Sunday afternoon in the garden. My mother dispatched one lengthy written communication, 4 pages of handwritten script that somehow managed to sidestep any authentic admission of wrongdoing, while concluding with a request for financial assistance on the final page. I filed the document without generating a response. Observers occasionally ask if I experience lingering emotional guilt over witnessing my family structure disintegrate. I offer them the objective truth. I did not strip a single asset from their possession. They reached out to grab a legacy that did not belong to them, only to discover that my grandfather had legally bolted it to the foundation. I relocated my permanent residence to Elmhurst Lane during the following autumn. I personally reconstructed the interior kitchen, utilizing Arthur's original hand tools for the detailed finish carpentry, and contracting professional tradesmen exclusively for the specialized electrical and plumbing systems I couldn't execute independently. I stripped the cedar porch swing down to raw timber and applied a fresh, clear sealant. The AS 1974 branding remains pristine and untouched, precisely where he originally burned it into the armrest. The solid brass door key now hangs from a dedicated metal hook positioned right beside the navy blue door, where it remains visible every single evening when I return from site inspections. I routinely test the mechanical deadbolt twice out of ingrained habit. The cylinder always holds secure. My family operated under the assumption that a quiet, low-maintenance woman represented an easy target for financial exploitation, and their assessment was exactly 50% accurate. I was fundamentally quiet, but I was never, under any circumstances, a safe target to exploit. Allow me to share where Arthur's forfeited funds were ultimately directed, the exact capital distributions my mother and brother statutorily forfeited through their actions. When he established his irrevocable trust decades ago, Arthur integrated a charitable remainder mechanism designed to support vocational education. When my relatives triggered the forfeiture clause, those funds capitalized what I formally established as the Arthur Sterling Memorial Trade Scholarship, an endowment dedicated to supporting first-generation university and vocational students entering civil engineering and the skilled construction trades. Young individuals who clean roof gutters, read spirit levels, and legitimately earn every professional opportunity they secure. Our inaugural pair of scholarship recipients commenced their studies this academic year. One of them is actively pursuing a degree in structural bridge engineering. I ensure my grandfather's solid brass key is resting on my desk every time I sign the annual disbursement certificates, because a home is ultimately just a commitment you keep to yourself. And as experience has demonstrated, so is your personal integrity and your name. That concludes my account. A single forged signature, a visionary grandfather who anticipated the betrayal decades in advance, and a structured binder of evidence that communicated everything I refused to waste my voice shouting. If this narrative reminds you to carefully examine the legal instruments bearing your signature, take the time to review your documents this week. And if someone you care about is currently functioning as the unappreciated, dependable foundation of their family unit, share this story with them today. Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Hit the subscribe button, and I will see you in our next case.